Good afternoon and welcome to this month's Northern Virginia Health Policy Forum. My name is Jim Scott and I'm the President and CEO of Applied Policy, a health policy and reimbursement consulting firm based in Alexandria, Virginia. My colleagues and I host these monthly gatherings to share information and exchange ideas with you on the issues shaping American healthcare today. Since the introduction of medical diagnostics and their expanded use throughout the 20th century, they have typically been defined as tests to aid in the detection or diagnosis of a disease. Today, the basic definition of diagnostics is changing to include not only what they can tell us about disease, but also what they can tell us about wellness. In 2023, we need to look no further than our wrists to monitor our heart rate, blood pressure, glucose levels, or other minute-to-minute measurements that will either satisfy our curiosity or warn us of serious threats to our health. At the same time, researchers are exploring innovative new approaches, including blood-based biomarkers, to develop and speed new ways to discover and treat potentially devastating conditions, including Alzheimer's disease and cancer. This rapid innovation has prompted government agencies to examine their approach to potentially regulating the field of diagnostics. We have two experts today to discuss issues informing those who develop diagnostics and those who use them. They are Zach Rothstein, Executive Director for AdvaMed DX, the association which represents manufacturers of in vitro diagnostic clinical tests in the United States and abroad, and Annie Scrimenti, Associate Director of Public Policy and Advocacy at the Association for Molecular Pathology, or AMP. Good afternoon, and thank you both for joining us.
Thanks, Jim. It's great to be here.
Thank you.
We'd like to start by discussing the FDA's recent proposed rule that would regulate in vitro diagnostics, specifically lab-developed tests. Zach, for those in the audience that may not be as familiar with these terms and acronyms, would you help us with what IVDs and LDTs are and what impacts what the FDA is proposing?
Yeah, sure. Well, first, let me just begin with a thank you, Jim, to you and to Applied Policy for the invitation to join today's forum. It's really a pleasure to be part of this group. Look, when we talk about in vitro diagnostics at the most basic level, we are talking about tests that are performed on human samples. So these are typically blood or tissue samples that are taken from the human body. We've all had them done. It's what you have done at the doctor's office. It's what hospitals rely on as well as they're working on patients too. And these tests ultimately inform the diagnosis of the disease. It might help monitor a patient's overall health. And it might even be used to prevent a particular disease. Now, interestingly, the way that we refer to these tests has really two names right now, and it's really because of a historical FDA decision here. So we talk about IVDs and LDTs. IVDs are what we typically would refer to as commercially developed tests. That is who we at AdvaMed DX and AdvaMed as an association represent. So these are the large manufacturers. You've probably heard of a lot of them, like BD and Roche and Abbott, and they make large testing equipment that goes into the labs. They also make what are called the test kits, and these are the kits that actually perform the test for particular blood panels or whatever other items you're trying to find within the sample. An LDT is, from a practical perspective, the exact same thing. But from a regulatory perspective at FDA's perspective, they are developed and used within a single laboratory. So rather than a commercially developed test that's distributed and then used within third-party laboratories, these are the tests that labs have developed typically on their own, maybe using material from the commercial suppliers, and then they go through a process to bring them to the physicians that they serve in their practices. So that's the distinction between the two types. So what is FDA proposing? So a couple weeks ago, it was big news in our space. The FDA issued what's called a proposed rule. So in our system of rulemaking across any regulatory agency, we have what's called notice and comment processes. And this is under something called the Administrative Procedures Act. And what you have to do as an agency is issue a proposed rule before you issue a final rule. And in this proposed rule, FDA is laying out what is a update in its policy for how it wants to regulate LDTs specifically. And so since the 70s, FDA has actually not enforced its regulatory authorities over the LDT community, meaning the FDA medical device regulations were not applied to LDT products. FDA has decided that it no longer wants to follow its old policy, and instead it wants to update its treatment of LDTs to bring them under FDA's traditional medical device regulations. And it would basically subject LDTs to the same FDA pre-market and post-market requirements that the IVD community currently goes through.
Thanks, Zach. And Annie, what's your take on the FDA's proposed rule, and will it impact patient access and provider burden, and anything else you want to add on IVDs and LDTs?
Thank you so much, Jim, and thank you very much for having me and for Applied Policy for holding this webinar. Greatly appreciate it, and think this is a very important conversation that we should be having. In regards to impact on patient access to care and administrative burden for providers, this rule would significantly impact both. It also would have some financial burdens, as the current cost in the proposed rule includes user fees and the need to finance the internal FDA compliance activities required under the rule. And so consequences of that would be consolidating testing menus, especially at community laboratories, which would then disrupt localized patient care, and also minimize innovative efforts at our most prestigious institutions. And the communities that would be significantly impacted by this are rural and underserved areas. And as far as administrative burdens, the rule has quite a few duplicative requirements that are already regulated under the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services Clinical Laboratory Improvement Amendment Act of 1988, also known as CLIA, which I'm sure a lot of the audience members are aware of. And so our members are already having to enforce CLIA requirements in their labs, such as establishing performance specifications, quality systems, conducting proficiency testing, undergoing inspections, and then correcting and reporting laboratory errors. They're already doing that. And so if the FDA rule were to be finalized, this would duplicate all of that. And as you all know about workforce shortages right now within lab communities, labs that are already stretched thin, many of our members, especially at small and medium-sized labs, would have to consolidate their testing menus to very minimal amounts of tests and or face closure, which would have significant disruption for patient access to care. And especially, it would also create gaps in care for those with rare diseases and other conditions if the proposed rule was finalized.
Thanks, Annie. Zach, we're getting some questions from the audience regarding Congress had some pending legislation that would do something similar to what the FDA is doing. Do you think the FDA's proposed rule is intended to push Congress to enact legislation, or how is what's different between the FDA's proposal and what the legislation would do?
Sure. So I think the two are certainly related. So let's maybe back up a little bit and talk about the Ballot Act, which is the bill that's probably most fresh in everybody's mind. But Congress for some time has been thinking about a legislative approach towards this issue and general what we call diagnostics regulatory reform. Valid was the latest iteration of this bill. It was pretty close to passing Congress at the end of last year. Ultimately, it didn't get through, and so it is not law, but it has been reintroduced this year. I believe in both chambers, but for sure in the House. So maybe just to talk a little bit about what Valid would do in its latest form. So Valid really has two components to it. The first is it would bring the LDTs under FDA's jurisdiction in a certain way, meaning that the current LDTs that are out there, for the most part, would be subject to at least some type of FDA oversight. But what it also does, and really for our companies, our members, what we really think Valid is so good at, is it creates a modernized regulatory environment for diagnostic tests that do go through FDA's review process. So, for example, there are provisions in Valid that would create a program called technology certification. This would be a novel approach to how FDA can look at diagnostic devices on the pre-market side and allow them to kind of iterate and otherwise be made to adapt into post-market settings without going through a new FDA review. Now, whether FDA put out its rule to push Congress or not, I actually don't know if it was really for Congress as much as maybe for the LDT community. And I say that because Valid on its face would be a much better option, at least in my opinion, for the LDT community than having FDA regulate these products under their current medical device regulations. Now, that being said, I think we all would benefit from a modernized FDA regulatory approach to diagnostics. And I say that because there are LDTs that do go through FDA's review right now. So, for example, when there is a public health emergency, like for COVID-19, EUAs for diagnostic tests had to go through the FDA process to get the COVID-19 test through and onto the market. And so we would, as a general community, benefit from these regulatory improvements to FDA's diagnostics framework. So I do think FDA had this in mind. I think also if you read the preamble to the FDA rule, there's a sense at the agency that from a public health perspective, it was time for the agency to act on this issue and that they had allowed Congress to at least debate and consider whether or not Congress would take legislative action. And in the absence of that action, FDA decided to take the next step. Whether Valid would still be necessary if the rule is final, I think is also a great question here. And I would say yes. And the reason is, again, the rule is very specific in that it simply brings LDTs under the existing medical device regulations. It does not modernize the regulatory environment that diagnostic tests would go through at FDA. Valid does that. And that's why we think Valid is still the best option on the table as a community to ensure that FDA has the tools necessary to bring these products through their systems and processes in the most efficient manner possible.
Thanks, Zach. Annie, which do the molecular pathologists prefer, Valid, the FDA regulation, or something else?
Thanks, Jim. We prefer something else, though we recognize Valid was a very complex piece of legislation that would have significant regulatory changes. Part of that would be consequences for patient access to care. And so we are looking to modernizing the systems that are already in place through CMS under what I mentioned before is CLIA, in addition to having state level requirements and professional accreditation bodies. We believe that this approach reflects today's practices and procedures that are offered clinically, and they would be the most streamlined, cost-effective approach. And just to give you a little bit of background on how molecular pathology kind of takes a look at this, laboratory developed testing procedures are testing services that hospitals, academic, and clinical labs develop and use in patient care. So AMP refers to LDTs actually as laboratory developed testing procedures, or LDPs, as in Peter at the end, because we feel that that best reflects the services that are being provided. And our members are health professionals practicing lab medicine, and LDPs are an integral part of the care that they provide to the patients. And so a little bit of difference between LDP regulation versus IVD test kits, for example. LDPs are not boxed and shipped medical devices, but as Zach said, they're designed, developed, validated, performed, and interpreted by board certified professionals within a single laboratory. And conversely, IVD test kits are more plug and play systems that are massively produced and distributed to customers who are independent from the company that manufactured them. So one key distinguishing feature is the role that the professional plays in every single aspect of LDP development, validation, and performance, which greatly reduces risk, because molecular pathology professionals, they have to understand every detail of the services they're providing. And they can also provide insights when healthcare providers, who often work in teams, are ordering tests for patients, and or they might need additional information about those test results. And so IVD test kits, they're not shipped in the mail with one of our members. So we feel that they should be under their own framework, and we are not seeking to change the FDA regulatory pathway for IVD testing kits, because we view those as quite different from LDP regulations that we feel should remain under CMS and CLIA.
Thank you. Are there cases where a lab uses the FDA non-enforcement of the LDT, its LDT authority, to essentially become a manufacturer, and instead of just using the LDT in its health system, it sort of doesn't have to go through FDA approval, but then makes it available nationwide?
So I can get back to you on that. I'm sure that there are cases where that has happened, but typically for traditional LDPs, they are just used in a single laboratory and they are not really commercialized. And so within the current FDA rule, we feel that it's inappropriate to treat these services provided by laboratory professionals as manufacturers. And so I hope that gives you a little bit of a sense. And Zach, if you'd like to add anything, please.
Yeah, well, maybe I can offer almost a distinction here in the LDT community, because Annie, you've done a really nice job describing one segment of it, but there are commercial enterprises that are out there that do market LDTs to patients and to other populations. And so these are outside of the traditional, hospital laboratories or even the big reference labs. These could be, the genetic testing companies or other kind of at-home test kits that you might be able to order. So there are LDTs out there that do fit into this commercial bucket, I think, much more neatly. And again, FDA does talk about these tests in their proposed rule as well. And I think, Annie, those are a bit outside the scope of who AMP represents. And that's maybe a bit of a distinction here.
Exactly. I was thinking of Oncotype DX when I asked that, and to some extent, there, in my mind, there at least should be a line somewhere where if you're going to act as a manufacturer like AdvaMed DX member, you should go through the same FDA approval if you're making a kit to market nationwide. Because that wasn't what the LDT non-enforcement exception was ever for. But that's my own opinion. So bottom line, Zach, would the FDA regulation help or hinder patients' access to IVD testing?
Look, I think it's still a little difficult for us to know the answer, partly because, and again, I'm just referring back to what FDA said in its proposed rule, we don't know how many LDTs are out there as a general matter. And the other part of it too, if we're looking more on that commercial side of the LDTs that we just discussed, I think, if anything, patient confidence would go up for those, test kits that we were just talking about. So overall, I don't think it should lead to any meaningful difference. But Annie, I'm guessing you probably have a different view, and I'd be happy to hear it.
Thanks, Beth. So I believe so there was an assessment done where about 14 genetic tests come to market each day, which would equate to around 5,000 applications per year for just genetic testing. So to give you that background, and then during COVID, from March 2021 to 2022, the FDA saw about 3,700 COVID IVD submissions. This was extremely overwhelming for the FDA. And so we believe that this would hinder patient access to testing, because we think that due to the delays that occurred during COVID, just with 3,700 tests, we don't feel that the FDA has the capacity to review the estimated 5,000 tests just for genetic testing alone. So we do believe that this would hinder patient access to IVD.
To follow up on that, Zach, if the regulation were passed as proposed and there were thousands of LDTs that now needed to be cleared by the FDA, does FDA have a plan or the staff to manage that volume of clearances?
Sure. So we think they do, and FDA does as well. And let me walk you through kind of the rationale there. So under the current proposed rule, there would be a 4-year phase-in period. So let's say the rule is finalized next August or September. In the first year, labs would have to start complying with some of the more minimum requirements, and up to year 4 is when all the existing LDTs would have to go through the FDA pre-market review. There's a couple factors that help offset some of the workload challenges. One is that we have this 4-year implementation period. So labs, don't have to wait till the last minute to try to get the LDTs through FDA. They can start even now looking at how to go through the FDA process and getting their ducks in a row to do so. The second factor is what we call the user fees that we pay into FDA for these reviews. So every 5 years, the medical device industry negotiates with FDA on a package of money that we will basically give to FDA in return for performance metrics on their review of pre-market submissions. So there's 2 main types of submissions. We have the 510K process, which, if you're familiar with the drug space, is kind of like a generic application. And then we have the PMA, which is a pre-market approval, which is more like a new drug approval process. And so each of those have different timelines associated with it, different user fee amounts associated with it. And just to give you a sense, I think today a 510K costs about $20,000. A PMA is in the mid $400,000 range. And so part of what we do in the user fee negotiations is we talk about the cost and we talk about the timelines that FDA will clear or approve these products once they receive the submission. And then the other piece is staffing. So we are right now, I think, in just the beginning of year 2 of the 5th MDUFA user fee cycle. And so it's a 5-year cycle. And in this 5-year cycle, we are ramping up FDA's review capacity about 2-fold, meaning between now and 4 years from now, we will have about double the number of reviewers at FDA. Also, within that 4-year period, we will enter into a new user fee negotiation with the agency. And so at that negotiation, assuming the rule is finalized, the LDT community would be part of those discussions, and we would work with FDA to find new numbers that would help both sides essentially get the products through the FDA in the most efficient amount of time as possible.
And Annie, in your members' opinions, are they ready to, if the rule's finalized, submit their tests for FDA clearance? And do they share the view that there will be enough FDA staff to expeditiously manage those applications?
So the short answer is no, they do not. And we again would just point to the modernization of CLIA, as we've done numerous times, as a pathway forward for updating regulatory requirements in a way that would protect patients and support innovation during both pandemic and non-emergency times. And again, we just believe that that is the most streamlined, cost-effective approach that's already in place. It just needs updating. And again, we're not for the status quo. AMP has never been advocating for the status quo, and so we're just looking to modernize the CLIA framework to reflect today's practices and procedures.
Great. I think I've got it. AMP would prefer modernizing the CLIA regulations, and AdvaMed DX would prefer regulating LDTs. And we'll have to leave it at that and turn to reimbursement for in vitro diagnostic tests. In 2014, the Protecting Access to Medicare Act, or PAMA law, brought a wide variety of changes to Medicare, including the method by which Medicare will calculate the rates it will pay under its clinical lab fee schedule. It requires Medicare to pay according to the weighted median rate of payments made by private insurers for the same lab tests. And when they looked at those rates, it resulted in reduced payments, which was the main reason for PAMA, was to bring Medicare payment rates more in line with what commercial plans were paying for the same tests and make a market-based system. There's different views that we'll hear about on whether that works. But nevertheless, though the cuts were delayed during COVID, they'll go back into effect in January 2024. Annie, because PAMA directly impacts your members, we are going to stick with you for the next couple of questions. What have been the impacts of the cuts we have seen so far from PAMA, and what do you think will happen on January 1st, 2024?
Those are good questions. Thank you. So since PAMA was enacted, a flawed data collection process has led to devastating cuts to Medicare payments, such that you had just mentioned. Originally, the Congressional Budget Office had projected $2.5 billion in cuts to reimbursement rates over a decade if PAMA had been implemented as Congress intended. However, the last 3 rounds of cuts have already reached $4 billion. And so for January, we are looking at cuts for up to 15% for approximately 800 tests in the clinical lab fee schedule. And there's a range from 20% cut for one test all the way up to a 59% cut for another test if PAMA is not delayed. However, given the current climate and although Congress is looking for a legislative fix through SALSA, which I believe we'll be talking about in a moment, I foresee that the cuts will be delayed for another year in January, along with data reporting requirements. I don't foresee PAMA being implemented on January 1st.
Thanks, Annie. And Zach, even though your members are manufacturers and don't bill Medicare directly for their tests, do the reimbursement cuts affect them?
Yeah, and actually, we do have a number of members that do both manufacture and operate labs that are impacted by PAMA. So, we believe that it's also, time for PAMA to be reformed. And everything Annie said is exactly what we agree with in terms of its issues.
Then, Annie, can you provide some additional details on how PAMA cuts unfairly impact molecular diagnostic testing?
Sure. So AMP actually did a survey of our members that was released earlier this year, and about 95% of respondents indicated that these reimbursement cuts would force them to stop offering new tests and or consolidate their menus. And so 3 main takeaways also from this survey were that the decreased reimbursement, it will stifle innovation, and almost all of our survey respondents expressed concern about offering a new test that would be crosswalked to a test whose reimbursement rate was declining, which would then disincentivize laboratories from bringing novel or improved tests to market. And just for those who don't know, crosswalking is when a reimbursement rate for a new lab test code comes out, and if there's another code already on the fee schedule that's equivalent or near equivalent, CMS uses that code to match the new test with it to set a particular reimbursement rate. And then there's another option: if there is no existing code on the fee schedule, then CMS will do a process called gap filling, the payment amount for a new test code if there is not one currently in existence. But the current, to get back to the payment cuts and how they affect our members, simple tests that don't require a lot of work and resources, such as a complete blood count, which our members use, and they're critical for patients when you're looking at red and white blood cells. And anyone with a cancer or other condition that requires constant regular blood monitoring, that test of the complete blood count would be cut by 35%, for example, if PAML were to go through. And there are several other pretty routine tests that would have significant cuts along the same lines. And so our members also noted that most of the tests that they would have to cut have to do with inherited or germline testing, as well as some infectious disease testing, and then oncology as well. So they would really have to consolidate their test menus and would not be able to offer tests at their facilities.
Zach, are there any other negative impacts that Annie didn't mention from your point of view?
Not that I can think of. I think she covered it really well.
And then also, the payment amount is one aspect, but on the other side, there's also coverage, whether the test is medically necessary or payable by Medicare or any other insurer at all. So looking at coverage, should we know about genetic testing for oncology and the impacts on the Medicare population or the elderly?
So widespread and equitable access to genetic testing in oncology is crucial because it supports accurate diagnoses, treatment plans, and the best health outcomes for cancer patients. There was a recent draft local coverage determination through the Medicare administrative contractors, Novitas and First Coast, that has several problematic provisions, which includes establishing parameters around when genetic testing for oncology will be considered medically reasonable and necessary. And so this is a coverage limitation that would have far-reaching implications because it would severely restrict coverage, which could lead to decreased patient access for much-needed diagnostic testing of cancers and then treatments. And for example, within the draft determination, the term unspecified, when used in an ICD-10 code, would not be covered. And an ICD-10 code classifies a diagnosis, a symptom, and a procedure for a reimbursement claim. So within this draft LCD, there are approximately 1,200 ICD-10 codes that are listed that would not be covered for treating cancer. And so, how would this impact patient access, right? Well, during late stage cancer treatment, the type of cancer or location of cancer, when it's too numerous to delineate, physicians regularly use these unspecified codes. So for late stage cancer patients, this would impact them heavily. Also, because they would not be able to receive treatment, they would not be covered under this draft determination. And physicians also commonly leave the location of a cancer unspecified when they are filing claims, especially for metastatic lung cancer. the targeted therapies are systemic, they're not localized. And so whether you have cancer in your right or left lung, it doesn't matter. So that's another example of an unspecified code that this would not be covered under. And so we believe that their approach leaves a lot of questions unanswered, as well about multi-gene panels and genomic sequencing procedures that are often the standard of care used by our members.
So no matter whether the test is listed as being paid $3,000 or not, it doesn't matter if it's not covered at all, because the Medicare won't pay anything for the test, and the patient would bear the full burden of the cost if they could afford it and convince the doctor to do it anyway. Do I have it right? Zach, any thoughts on the LCDs or coverage of oncology tests?
I would just add the Novitas issue was quite significant on our end as well. We work really closely with a number of organizations in the community to try to get it into a better place. But I think there's still work that needs to be done there. So it is something that's very much front and center for our organization. And again, we work with others like AMP, like ACLA, to really try to make sure that these policies don't interrupt the patient care that's so needed.
Thanks. So bottom line is, barring congressional action, there would be cuts of up to 15% per year beginning in 2024 under PAMA if Congress does nothing. But there's apparently a potential legislative solution called SALSA. Zach, what is SALSA?
Yeah, so, just in full disclosure, we talked about how I could try to come up with a joke with salsa, but it just felt like it was too much pressure to come up with something meaningful. So salsa, I'll just go right into it. It is essentially a fix for PAMA that the whole industry, and when I say that, I mean all the organizations that I mentioned before, have been working on. It's the full name of the bill is Sustainable Access for Laboratories to Services Act. And effectively, it's not a very big bill. It just adjusts the methodology that's used in PAMA. So as Annie mentioned before, the methodology is flawed. This bill would update the PAMA methodology to basically make sure that reimbursement is consistent and fair, and that we continue to have access to the lab services that are impacted by PAMA. I mentioned we have this large coalition working on SALSA. We have dozens of co-sponsors in the House and in the Senate that have proposed SALSA this year. That being said, I think it's safe to say a path forward in Congress right now before the end of the year is complicated at best, and probably unlikely to be more blunt about it. And so there is discussion now within our community of, do we start to now seek another 1-year delay for the PAMA cuts like we got last year? And so that's where the conversation is now among the trade organizations. We still think SALSA is the better fix because it's permanent. But PAMA, at least having a delay around it, would be, the next best thing right now that we could potentially get.
Thanks. And Annie, does AMP support SALSA as an improvement to PAMA?
Yes, we do wholeheartely, and I believe Zach covered everything. He's spot on, and we are hoping that SALSA would get passed ideally, although we do recognize that it has a high cost associated with it. And so until the Congressional Budget Office were to kind of lower that score, it's unfortunately not as feasible a legislative option, at least this Congress. But we are looking forward to its passage, hopefully soon.
Thanks. And we have a question from the audience. They're asking, if SALSA doesn't pass this year, how likely do you think another 1-year freeze would be? And then also, is it true that another freeze would actually save the government money? And if so, how?
So maybe I'll go first, and also Annie, be happy to pass it to you. But my gut is that yes, it's still very much within the realm of possibility for us to get the 1 year delay, just given that Congress has done this in the past. The need for education is a lot lower than it has been before. Congress is aware of this issue and understands where it stands. So as long as Congress is able to pass bills later this year, I think it's safe to say there's a good chance, we'd be successful in our advocacy around it. And Jim, remind me the second part of the question.
It says, is it true that another freeze would
the
actually
scoring.
save the government money?
Yeah, so that's referring to the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office. They do what's called scoring bills. So they try to look at a bill's potential impact on economic activity and what it would do to the federal budget and deficit. And somehow they calculated that a 1 year delay of PAMA saves the government money. I have no idea how they came up with that number. And I know a lot of us in the community struggle to understand it, but it's a good thing, theoretically speaking, from an advocacy perspective. My best guess here is that it has to do with kind of the initial costs with implementing a new bill, which is how you save money. But honestly, I don't know the exact reason. And I know this question has been asked at some of our events too in the past. And I think our speakers have been a bit troubled with articulating the exact reason that CBO came up with that number.
Thanks. Annie, anything to add?
I would just echo what Zach said. We have no idea how it saves them money, but because it does, yes, we think that there will be another delay of cuts and data reporting in January.
Well, so I think it's fair to say that while both your organizations disagree on the approach to LDT regulation, you both agree that the PAMA cuts need to be stopped. So
actually, Jim, let me just kind of clarify here. I mean, the LDT regulation, because I did see a couple of comments. I mean, it's not something that really impacts us as an industry. I mean, the LDT regulation that FDA has proposed impacts LDTs. We already go through the FDA process. And as I mentioned before, what we really think is the benefit of VALID is the regulatory reform proposals that it includes. And so that's still where our focus remains. We have said, and we continue to believe, that we think FDA has the authority to do what it's doing. But again, the rule isn't something, that we're coming out saying, we think this is the best thing since sliced bread. I mean, again, we think VALID is a better approach overall for what both FDA and Congress have been trying to do here.
Thanks. Is the comment period still open on the FDA regulation?
And I think it closes December 4th. There have been some requests in the docket to extend it, and that's something FDA would decide on. Hopefully, if they decide one way or another in the next couple of weeks, they would let the community know.
Yeah, and then if the FDA, when would we expect the FDA to, have reviewed the comments and finalize this, and then their new regulation to actually apply to labs in the real world if they were to, continue on the path they are now?
Yeah, the regulatory process is a bit of a black box, not in that you don't understand how it works, but the timing can be difficult. And this timing could be particularly interesting for a couple of reasons. So just to kind of highlight a few of them. So first, FDA has to review all the comments. And I suspect this docket will generate hundreds, if not thousands, of comments from the communities that it impacts. So FDA needs to evaluate them. They then need to develop a final rule if they choose to move in that direction. And in the final rule, they have to respond to all the comments they received. And they do this by grouping, common themes of the comments together, but they'll have to do that. So this will take FDA some time to generate the final rule. They might, modify what was in the proposed rule based on the comments. They might not. And then it goes to an organization within the government called OIRA, the Office of Industry and Regulatory Affairs. And that group sits within OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, and it clears all federal agency rules before they go out into publication in the Federal Register. And so there's a process where OIRA is how we say OIRA. OIRA has to review the rule. They usually go back and forth with the agency, regardless of whether it's FDA or EPA or FTC. They go back and forth, and at some point, OIRA needs to sign off on it. And so when that happens, it can then be published in the Federal Register. So I think it's fair to say, you're looking at from close of the docket to FDA publication in the best of times, anywhere from 6 to 12 months for any particular rule, not this one in particular, but just any regulatory rulemaking that an agency goes through. Generally, they can take a lot longer too. I mean, you could see 2 to 5 years for some rulemakings, but I think FDA is keen to get this out sooner than later. The other factor here, and why I think they'd get it out within the 6 to 12 month window, is the election that's taking place next November. We don't know who will control Congress. We don't know who will control the White House after that election. And so from FDA's perspective, now is the best time for them to try to get that rule out before the chance of everything flipping to the other party. And so that is another factor here that I think the agency is considering in how they go through the rulemaking process.
Great. So this, whatever the FDA does, won't take effect on January 1st, 2024. Extremely unlikely. More likely January 1st, 2025, or beyond.
And so if you want to really play the game, let's say the rule's finalized October 1st, it's published October 1st next year to go into effect. I think the proposed rule said within 30, 60, or 90 days of its publication, it would become the law, right? Or the reg. The effective date. Sorry, that's the word I'm looking for. Well, at that point, I think it's highly likely the LDT community will file a lawsuit against the rule. And part of that filing would include likely some type of injunctive relief from the rule taking effect while it's pending any type of court decision. And if a stay is granted, then the rule would not become effective as intended by FDA. It would have to go through the courts. And it's a rule that, at least personally, I think has the potential to go all the way up to the Supreme Court, given some of the jurisdictional arguments that the lab community have made in the past. So this could be quite a long process from both a regulatory and a legal perspective. But no doubt, I think once it is finalized, I would expect to see some lawsuits filed, and whether or not that further delays its implementation, we'll just have to see.
Thanks. Annie, anything to add on that?
As Zach covered just about everything, and we do think that if they do kind of rush the finalization of this rule before the election, that it is very highly likely that it will be tied up in litigation, the courts.
Thank you. I think that's really helpful for the audience to remind them it's just a proposed rule. It's not the rule yet.
Also, I know, Jim, we're trying to move on, but the other thing is proposed rules change a lot from proposed to final. It doesn't mean this one will, but that's just another area, and the reason why the commenting process is important, because proposed rules do get changed based on the comments that are submitted. So we don't know today what a final rule would even look like. That part of that depends on the docket that's developed and how FDA evaluates the comments.
Thank you. So let's finish up with a little conversation about Alzheimer's disease. There's been a lot of developments in the treatment of Alzheimer's disease on the pharmaceutical side, which probably will result in a greater call for testing on the diagnostic side. So an estimated 6.5 million Americans age 65 and older are living with Alzheimer's today, and that number could grow to nearly 14 million by 2060 if the disease goes unchecked. So Zach, in the realm of advocacy, what's most important for stakeholders working to improve Alzheimer's disease diagnostic testing?
Sure. So thanks, Jim. It's a bit of a big kind of loaded question. So maybe just kind of from the high end here, just to bring everybody up to speed with kind of how we look at the Alzheimer's reimbursement landscape. So historically, CMS had a national coverage determination for PET scans. That was effectively eliminated. And now the testing determinations are done at the local levels. And so we think that that's definitely the right place for these determinations to be made at this time. And with it, the initial coverage was about PET testing, which is an imaging diagnostic, not an in vitro diagnostic that we manufacture. But I don't think it would be surprising if we were to see some type of LCD on CSF and blood-based testing for Alzheimer's come out soon, just given the interest and importance of the issue for Medicare patients. And also, in light of the recent drug approvals, there would be sound, clear coverage determinations that need to be put in place. It would be important for them to be put in place, both for Medicare and Medicare Advantage plans, since the Medicare Advantage plans have to provide at least what the Medicare plans cover.
Great, thanks, Zach. And then sticking with you for a moment, what does the regulatory landscape look like for diagnostic testing of Alzheimer's disease, and how does the FDA approach approval of those tests?
Yeah, so generally speaking, the regulatory landscape is not. So in a pure diagnostic environment, it's not terribly different than any other diagnostic, showing the clinical validity and specificity for FDA to look at and understand that the test will work as intended. I think there's also another aspect here, which is on the companion diagnostic side. So FDA recently announced a new pilot around companion diagnostics. And so for those of you not familiar with them, these are diagnostic tests that are kind of tied to a particular therapeutic, in the sense that the diagnostic might help you determine if the patient is a good candidate for the therapeutic, or if the therapeutic is working well for the patient once they're on it. And that pilot is just another opportunity, I think, for FDA to look at ways to bring some of these novel tests to market, to make sure that patients and clinicians, have kind of the information they need as they start using them to tie up with a particular therapeutic product.
And on the reimbursement side, does Medicare pay for the genetic tests to determine sort of your predisposition to have Alzheimer's, or what kind of Alzheimer's you might have?
It's probably a better question for Annie.
Annie.
So it depends on which jurisdiction of the Medicare administrative contractors you typically live within. There are 12 of those throughout the country, and they tend to determine which genetic tests are covered in that particular region, and then working with your Medicare or Medicare Advantage plan as well. So it just depends, but overall, and it also depends on the complexity of that genetic test too, right? So it's just kind of test dependent.
Thanks. Are there ways to ensure the affordability and accessibility of these newer Alzheimer's diagnostic tests?
So AMP's position on direct-to-consumer testing is, if a test has good analytical and clinical validity, as Zach was mentioning, and it's been properly validated, we support consumers having access to clinically meaningful tests. Because we believe that it's important that everybody does have tests in general, and if they are direct-to-consumer and they have been validated, then we're in full support of that.
Great. So thank you both. And we're approaching the end of our time here. But Annie, what's one thing you'd like our audience to remember from our conversation today?
I would say that if finalized, the FDA proposed rule would have, it would be an incredible upheaval in our healthcare system at large, because it would limit patient access to clinical tests and disrupt the innovation of laboratory developed testing procedures.
Thank you, Annie. And Zach, your final thought.
In follow-up to what Annie just said, that the ballot act is the better way to go.
Thank you both. That brings us to the end of this month's Northern Virginia Health Policy Forum. We appreciate you both being with us today and your insights on the development in the diagnostic testing field that impact all of us. I also want to thank the members of our audience for joining us today and the members of our applied policy team for their work in putting this forum together. In the next 2 months, we'll hold separate forums discussing artificial intelligence and Medicare Advantage and what these mean for the industry and our patients. We'll be in touch with you and the rest of our mailing list as we finalize the dates. Again, thank you for joining us today and enjoy the rest of your day.